Hey there, sleepless rabble. Tonight we're diving into one of the darkest and most twisted true crime stories of the internet age. Don't Fuck with Cats isn't just a catchy title, it's a rule carved in stone. Because here at NatMax, we don't just love cats, we worship them. And that's why this story cuts so deep. You probably know the Netflix documentary, but we're going further. We'll uncover the hidden details, the digital breadcrumbs, the obsession of the online sleuths who became real-life heroes. And on top of that, we'll tell you what this dirtbag is up to today. Trust me, you won't believe it. And listen, this channel is still young, still clawing its way into the algorithm. So if you care about stories that matter, if you care about justice for the voiceless, hit that like button. Drop us a comment. What punishment do you think he really deserved? And don't forget to subscribe. This is NatMax True Crime, and you're listening to the story of the internet's most infamous manhunt. Don't fuck with cats. Let's start where it all began. Scarborough, Ontario. Summer of 1982. A suburb that was half strip malls and half apartment blocks. The kind of place where families scraped by and kids rode their bikes until the streetlights came on. Cats lounged on porches, claimed backyards as kingdoms, and slipped through alleyways like tiny gods in fur coats. Life, for the most part, was ordinary. But not for the newborn who arrived on July 24th. His name was Eric Clinton Kirk Newman, a name that should have stayed invisible. A boy who should have had the chance to grow into something unremarkable. Like the guy who fixes your boiler or shelves tins at the grocery store. Instead, Eric would spend his life trying to force the world to notice him. And when the world refused, he'd twist himself into something darker. His parents were barely more than kids themselves. His father, Donald, lived with schizophrenia, slipping in and out of reality. His mother, Anna, was strict, controlling, religious to the point of fanaticism. Together they made a house that felt less like a home and more like a locked box. Eric wasn't allowed out into the neighborhood. No schoolyard games, no friendships built over scratched knees or shared sweets. Until 6th grade, he was homeschooled, which in practice meant kept indoors, fed rules instead of experiences, and watched with a suffocating intensity. So while other children were outside climbing fences or chasing cats down the street, Eric sat alone. He learned how to live inside his own head. He learned how to craft an inner world where he wasn't powerless, where he could invent and reinvent himself endlessly. Cats, of course, don't need to reinvent themselves. Cats are born perfect. Maybe that's one of the many reasons his kind always resented them. They had everything he wanted. Grace, presence, self-possession, without ever trying. When he finally did show up at school, he was pale, awkward, and easy prey. Teachers noticed he kept to himself. Classmates remembered him as the kind of kid you could bully without consequence, because no one would stand up for him. The world stamped outsider across his forehead in permanent ink. And to someone like Eric, who craved approval, the rejection was unbearable. By the mid-90s, after his parents' marriage collapsed, Eric drifted into group homes. Psychiatrists passed him around like a file nobody wanted to hold. Diagnoses stacked up. Paranoid schizophrenia, borderline personality disorder, narcissism. Depending on who you asked, he was either mentally ill, manipulative, or both. And maybe he was all of it at once. But let's pause here. Many children grow up in fractured homes. Many endure bullying, isolation, or controlling parents. And they don't become monsters. They don't lash out at the innocent. They don't hurt animals. the most defenseless companions we've got. If you're a cat person, and I am, unapologetically, you already know, what someone does to a cat tells you everything you need to know about their soul. And Eric? His soul was already curdling, because what he learned in those years wasn't resilience or empathy or strength. What he learned was how to disappear, how to lie, how to slip into masks and live behind them. He learned that if he couldn't get the world's admiration honestly, he'd demand it by force. The boy from Scarborough never wanted to be Eric Newman. He wanted to be anyone but Eric. He wanted to be dazzling, untouchable, unforgettable. And when life kept handing him mediocrity, he began plotting a way out. A new name, a new face, a new self. The fantasy was taking shape. And soon, Eric Newman would be dead. In his place, Luca Magnotta, the persona he crafted like a weapon. A mask he thought the world could never look away from. Unfortunately, he was right. Eric Newman was dead. At least that's what he told himself in 2006, when he marched into court and legally buried the name his parents had given him. From that day forward, he would be known as Luca Rocco Magnotta. Sounds flashy, right? Like a second-rate fashion designer or a B-list Bond villain. In reality, it was just Eric, hiding behind a name he stitched together like a knockoff handbag. Rocco came from a porn star, Rocco Siffredi. Magnotta from a wine company in Ontario. Put them together and voila, a brand new persona. He thought it sounded continental, glamorous, dangerous. To anyone else, it was paper-thin cosplay. But to Eric, now Luca, it was the mask he'd wear for the rest of his life. He wasn't content with just a new name. He started reshaping his face too. Botox, nose jobs, jawline tweaks, cosmetic surgery as performance art, except there was no audience. Just him in the mirror, desperately trying to sculpt a star out of clay that was never meant to shine. He was obsessed with becoming somebody. The problem was, he had no talent, no craft, no skill to offer the world. So he fell back on the only thing he could control, how he looked and what lies he told. And oh, the lies. Luca invented stories like other people collect stamps. He told anyone who would listen that he had dated Karla Homolka, the infamous Canadian schoolgirl killer. Total nonsense, of course. But he dropped her name like a sick little PR stunt, hoping her notoriety would rub off on him. He planted fake fan pages about himself. He left comments under different aliases, praising his own beauty, his own allure. Imagine the desperation of spending your nights writing love letters to yourself on the internet, pretending strangers adored you. That was Luca's reality. He tried to wedge his way into show business. There were porn shoots under aliases, awkward modeling gigs, even a humiliating TV spot on Plastic Makes Perfect, where he talked about his surgeries. He was supposed to be tragic and glamorous, a broken doll yearning for perfection. Instead, he came across as what he truly was, a man trying way too hard. But here's the thing about Luca Magnotta. He believed his own lies. He built a fantasy world and lived in it so fully that he thought the rest of us would eventually be forced to play along. He believed that if he just kept reinventing himself, new face, new name, new myth, the universe would hand him the fame he thought he deserved. And yet, nothing happened. No one cared. Casting directors ignored him. Modeling agencies passed him over. The only people paying attention were debt collectors because by 2007, he'd declared bankruptcy with over $17,000 owed. Luca was a nobody in a city full of nobodies. And for someone like him, that was unbearable. Because Luca's dream wasn't to succeed. It wasn't even to be liked. His dream was to be seen. to force the spotlight onto himself, no matter the cost. And when the world didn't give him fame willingly, he decided to drag it kicking and screaming. This was the stage where the fantasy hardened into obsession. Eric Newman was gone. Luca Magnotta was born. But Luca wasn't just another identity. He was a character crafted with one purpose: to make sure the world never looked away again. And if Luca couldn't rise through talent or beauty, he'd rise through something else entirely. Something darker. Something that would stain his name in history. And that's when the cats came in. Luca Rocco Magnotta wanted fame the way a drowning man wants air. He wanted it so badly, he mistook reflection for oxygen, kept inhaling his own image and wondering why he still felt empty. After the name change came the hustle, escort ads dressed up as glamour, threadbare modeling calls, awkward adult shoots under disposable aliases. It was all surface, cheap lights, cheaper rooms, the brittle sound of a photographer pretending to be impressed. He posed, he pouted, he practiced seduction like a language he never truly spoke. He auditioned for limelight in any room that would have him. Daytime talk, snippets. A segment on a plastic surgery docu-show where he confessed to nips and tucks as though confession itself might make him interesting. He wanted to be the tragic beauty who suffered for perfection. He landed closer to a man reciting a shopping list of procedures and calling it destiny. Agencies passed. Producers smiled and forgot his name before the lift doors closed. Toronto, then Montreal, new flats, new mirrors, same disappointment. Money, of course, dragged behind him like a wounded leg. There was the earlier fraud conviction. Stupid, small-time greed, masquerading as hustle. And then, the inevitable bankruptcy. Debt stacked, promises collapsed. A dramatic declaration of ruin that somehow made him feel a little famous for a day. Insolvency paperwork as self-promotion. Even his disasters were drafted as press releases. Online, he played maestro to an orchestra of ghosts. He built fan pages about himself, then logged in under other names to admire the man he wished existed. He seeded rumors and invented romance with a notorious killer, because if you can't borrow talent, you can at least borrow infamy. He left breadcrumbs across forums and comment threads, performing a one-man standing ovation for an audience that was mostly him. It wasn't confidence. It was starvation with a ring light. He kept altering the exterior. Botox here, a sharper line there, because the world had not yet delivered the role he believed he deserved. It never occurred to him that the missing piece wasn't the jawline. It was the substance. Talent earns attention slowly, predation steals it quickly. He was tired of slow, and cats, our saints in whiskers, carried on being perfect without asking permission. They do not audition. They do not seek applause. They glide into a room and it becomes theirs. Imagine how that looked to a man like him. Effortless presence. Effortless love. Given freely to those who deserve it. Cats have what narcissists can't counterfeit. Poise without performance. I don't know when envy curdled into grievance for him. Only that it did. And that it was fatal. Here's the grim arithmetic of his broken career. The more he was ignored, the more extreme the theatre had to become. Each knockback turned the dial a notch. Each closed door taught him the same poisonous lesson. If you can't earn attention, engineer it. He wanted headlines. He wanted strangers to learn his name without cue cards. Not tomorrow. Now. So the auditions dried up. The debt nipped at his heels. The masks started to feel flimsy even to him. And somewhere between the last failed casting And the next fabricated fan comment? He made a choice that would turn desperation into ritual. He decided that the fastest path to notoriety wasn't talent, nor work, nor time. It was harm. It was spectacle. It was the cold certainty that cruelty spreads quicker than craft. The career, if we can call it that, lay in shards. The mirror, however, was intact, because he never stopped looking into it. And in that reflection, he found the only thing he could still control: what to do next to make us watch. What came next would not be a performance. It would be the opposite of art. It would be the part where our beloveds, our soft, purring anchors, walk into his frame, and everything gets colder. The first time he uploaded one of those videos, the internet didn't quite know what it was looking at. A grainy clip, a pale young man, a bedspread, and two kittens so small their paws barely gripped the fabric. And then, plastic. A vacuum-sealed nightmare. The kittens squirming inside a bag, the air vanishing, the camera rolling. He filmed it. He staged it. He smiled. This was 2010, the Wild West of online sleuthing. Viral content still meant shaky camera phones and bad lighting. But cruelty? That traveled fast. People stumbled across the clip and recoiled, the way you would if you saw someone kick a baby in the street. You don't forget it. You can't unsee it. And within days, forums lit up like signal flares. Who the hell is this man? Find him. Stop him. And that's the point, isn't it? Luca wanted to be found. He wanted the outrage. He wanted the disgust. He had staged the scene with props, a specific vacuum, a poster in the background, even the music he chose. Breadcrumbs, left like gifts to a future audience. Because for him, fame didn't matter if no one was chasing him. Attention meant nothing unless it was dragged from people kicking and screaming. The internet responded in kind. A Facebook group appeared. Find the Kitten Vacuumer. It swelled with members. Strangers who'd never met became detectives overnight, trading screenshots, enhancing shadows, identifying cigarette brands. One woman, Deanna Thompson from Las Vegas, noticed details most people would miss. A plug socket, the type of bedspread, the light in the room. Another man, John Green in Los Angeles, cross-referenced objects like a crime scene analyst with Wi-Fi. And what did law enforcement do? Almost nothing. Animal welfare groups were swamped with complaints, but they treated it like internet noise. The police had bigger problems, or so they said. But the online sleuths? They weren't letting it go. Because anyone who hurts kittens, the most defenseless, trusting creatures alive, doesn't stop there. We knew it. Cat lovers everywhere knew it. The pattern is ancient. Cruelty starts small, then escalates. Luca escalated quickly. More clips appeared. Another kitten drowned in a bathtub. One fed to a python. A vacuum cleaner hose aimed at something alive. The production values grew. The sadism sharpened. And each time, he dangled new clues in front of the internet. Like he wanted to play hide and seek with the whole world. Imagine the arrogance. Imagine knowing people are hunting you because you suffocated a kitten. And deciding to upload more. That's not ignorance. That's provocation. It's spitting in the face of anyone who still believes decency exists online. And the community hunting him? They became obsessed. Screenshots of Luca's hands were compared to model photos. His reflection in a TV screen was enhanced, cropped, debated. Groups argued, split, reformed. Some misidentified suspects. Innocent men harassed because of a passing resemblance. It wasn't perfect. It was messy, human, desperate, but it was relentless. Because while Luca thought he was controlling the game, he underestimated one thing. Cat people do not forgive. You can scam fans, you can fake careers, you can vanish into a new name, but you lay one hand on a kitten, and the internet becomes an army. And still, Lucas smirked behind his camera. He thought he was untouchable. He thought his cruelty made him a star. But all it really did was sharpen the claws of the people who were closing in. The hunt was alive now, furious and determined. And every new video he dropped was another breadcrumb leading straight back to him. And when the breadcrumbs ran out, Luca Magnotta crossed the line no one wanted him to cross. From cats to humans, from cruelty to murder, and suddenly, the whole world was watching. And yet, while the world scrolled past and the authorities shrugged, there was one corner of the internet that refused to look away. You'd think law enforcement would have stormed in after the first video. 2 kittens suffocated in plastic, a faceless man behind the camera. It should have been enough to rattle cages at every police precinct. But no, the response was a collective shrug. It's the internet, they said, hard to trace. Bureaucracy yawned. So who picked up the slack? Ordinary people, strangers behind keyboards, cat lovers who refused to scroll past cruelty. And let me say this clearly, these people are the reason Luca Magnotta didn't get away with everything. They weren't paid, they weren't trained, they weren't sworn officers, they were just people who looked at those kittens, felt the horror in their stomachs, and said, no, not on our watch. There was Deanna Thompson in Las Vegas, headphones on, eyes locked on every pixel of those disgusting clips. Not a detective by trade, but a data analyst with a hawk's attention and a heart that would not let the cruelty slide. And there was John Green in Los Angeles, tech-savvy, patient, analytical. Together they built a digital manhunt, a Facebook group, screenshot repositories, long threads where people argued over cigarette brands and wallpaper patterns and the exact model of a vacuum cleaner. It sounds absurd, until you realize this was all they had. He had made it a game, leaving breadcrumbs in plain sight, smirking behind his mask. These strangers took the bait, not because they wanted to play, but because they wanted to end the game before he escalated. First, the vacuum. In one clip, the camera drifted just far enough to catch it in the corner. Most viewers would have ignored it. The sleuths froze the frame, zoomed, compared shapes and logos until they landed on a Royal Sovereign model sold primarily in Canada. One unloved appliance, and the world map got smaller. Second, the wolf blanket. A cheap, tacky comforter draped on the bed. It reappeared in later videos like a watermark, a clumsy calling card. Every time those wolves stared back at the lens, the group knew they were looking at the same space, the same man, the same pattern of harm dressed up as theatre. Third, the cigarettes. Boxes scattered on the floor, not glamorous imports, not obscure brands, ordinary Canadian packs. To most people they were trash. To the group, they were a compass, pointing firmly to North America whenever his sock puppet accounts bragged that he was overseas. Fourth, the outlets. A wall socket is nothing until you care enough to look. The sleuths looked North American style, not European. Slight differences in shape and spacing, the kind of detail you would never notice unless you were desperate to stop someone. With every small confirmation, the fog thinned. Fifth, reflections. Mirrors and dark screens gave him away. A warped outline of a dresser in the glass. The angle of a window in a TV reflection. These glimpses let the group sketch the room he thought he had hidden. They built a mental floor plan from light and shadow, like burglars casing a house they never entered. 6th, geolocation outdoors. He filmed a short piece outside, cars passing, a balcony edge, a particular street lamp, and the way the road markings curved away. People cross-checked Google Street View, block by block, until a grid of balconies and lampposts matched. Montreal. And not just Montreal. A neighborhood. A set of possibilities that narrowed with every screenshot. 7th, the aliases. He loved the chase so much he walked into the hunting party. Dozens of fake accounts slipped into the group, taunting, deflecting, sometimes praising him as if he were a legend already. He recycled favorite film quotes, used the same turns of phrase, even repeated the same typos. His ego was a fingerprint. The group learned it by heart. 8th, the soundtracks. Background music buried under the hiss of bad audio. The sleuths pulled out short phrases and loops, traced them to cheap pop tracks he leaned on, and tied them back to other posts carrying the same musical DNA. It was another thread, small but strong, binding his online personas to his staged cruelty. They also chased packaging, the plastic vacuum bags, the kind of retailer that stocked them. They compared the exact shade of yellow on a vacuum in a selfie to the yellow in the video, a dull little color match that kept pointing back to the same man. They checked light through curtains and guess time of day, then compared that guess to upload times. They obsessed over the tiniest edges of information, because every edge mattered. Were they perfect? Number leads went astray. An innocent man was misidentified and harassed before the group corrected course. That is the danger of crowds without a badge. But the intent, the relentless drive to protect the voiceless, was pure. They weren't just solving a crime. They were fighting for the dignity of every creature too small to defend itself. And while all this was happening, he pushed back. He mocked them, teased them, fed them lies. He wanted to be untouchable. He dangled clues like toys. He underestimated the one law you never break. Do not mess with cat people. If you harm cats, the internet becomes a vigilante army with endless time, caffeine, and fury. We hail them. The real heroes of this story. Not the police who sat on reports, not the bureaucrats who shrugged, the keyboard warriors, the sleepless analysts, the obsessed few who poured hours into cross-checking shadows and soundtracks. They turned their rage into evidence. They mapped his world from a handful of pixels. They documented what authorities would later use. Their case file rivaled the official one in depth and speed. They paid a price for it. You cannot stare into deliberate cruelty and walk away untouched. They carried the images so the rest of us didn't have to. They kept watch, like a vigil in the dark, because someone had to, and because nobody with power moved until a human body forced them to. Without them, he might have kept torturing in the shadows. Without them, he might never have been unmasked before the worst of it. These were the digital bloodhounds that picked up the trail when institutions failed. So yes, we hail them. We raise a glass, we light a candle, we crown them with every medal their governments never gave them. In a world where cruelty went viral, these people chose to resist. They were right to resist, because as they warned, he was escalating. He wanted a bigger audience, a bigger stage, a bigger crime. The internet was closing in. He felt it and he leaned into the only script he knew. Shock them again. Force them to watch. Make yourself unforgettable. And this time, the victim wouldn't be a cat. It was only a matter of time. Everyone who watched those kitten videos knew it. Every psychologist who's ever studied cruelty knew it. Every cat lover in that Facebook group felt it in their gut. If he can do this to them, he'll do it to us. And in May 2012, Luca Magnotta finally crossed the line. The victim was Jun Lin, a 33-year-old international student from Wuhan, China. He was studying computer science at Concordia University in Montreal, quietly building a life for himself. He was described by friends as kind, funny, gentle, the kind of person you'd want in your corner. He had just ended a relationship and was living alone, dating casually, meeting new people. On May 24th, he met Luca. What happened next was filmed. Because of course Luca filmed it. He always needed an audience. He uploaded a video with the charming title, One Lunatic One Ice Pick. A grotesque sequel to his kitten clips, but this time the stakes were no longer practice. This was murder. The footage, which thankfully most of the world has never seen, is infamous in the darkest corners of the internet. It shows Junlin drugged, restrained. Luca appears on screen with an ice pick. Straight out of Basic Instinct, because even in murder he was plagiarizing. He stabs Junlin repeatedly. He dismembers him. He plays with the body like it's a prop. There are moments too horrific to describe in detail, but know this. It was staged to shock, to force headlines, to make Luca the monster star he always wanted to be. And he didn't stop there. He mailed body parts across Canada like grotesque fan mail, a foot to the Conservative Party headquarters, a hand to the Liberal Party, more packages intercepted en route to schools, each parcel wrapped like a publicity stunt. Because for Luca, that's exactly what they were. He wasn't hiding his crime, he was advertising it. Meanwhile, Junlin's torso was found stuffed in a suitcase left in a Montreal alley. Neighbors noticed the smell, reporters swarmed the scene, and within hours, his name, Luca Magnotta, was blasted across the world. He'd achieved the fame he craved, but at the cost of an innocent man's life. Here's the part that chills me. He planned this. The video wasn't some spontaneous act. He had teased it online, hinted at escalation, even posted under fake accounts predicting the next big thing in shock videos. He wanted people to anticipate it, to dread it. He wanted to be the boogeyman who stepped out of the screen and into the news. And yet, for all his theatrics, Luca was still just a man with a knife, a camera, and a festering ego. He thought he was writing his legend. What he really did was turn the entire world against him. Junlin deserved none of this. He wasn't a symbol. He wasn't part of Luca's twisted narrative. He was a human being, loved by family, mourned by friends, and Luca reduced him to a prop in his performance. For that alone, he deserves every ounce of hate we can summon. The sleuths who had been tracking Luca for years now screamed into the void. We told you. We told you this would happen. And suddenly, authorities who had ignored the kitten videos snapped awake. It was too late for Junlin, but the chase for Luca had begun in earnest. The Canadian press called him the Canadian Psycho. Interpol issued a red notice, and Luca, delighted, terrified, craving and dreading the spotlight, packed his bags and fled the country. The monster was loose, and the whole world was finally looking. But Luca had one fatal weakness, his obsession with himself, and that was exactly what would bring him down. The murder of Junlin didn't stay a local story for long. You can't mail body parts to political headquarters and expect it to go unnoticed. Within hours of the torso being found in that Montreal alley, Luca Magnotta was no longer just an online rumor or a subject of internet sleuth threads. He was international news. Interpol issued a red notice, the digital equivalent of slapping wanted posters across the globe. The Canadian media dubbed him the Canadian Psycho, Because of course they did. He wanted a nickname, a mythology, and now he had one. Headlines screamed his name, his photos, his poses, his fake glamour shots, all the masks he'd created were suddenly plastered across every screen. And Luca? He ran. First stop, Paris. He slipped out of Montreal on a flight, leaving behind his blood-soaked apartment, leaving behind Junlin's family to grapple with the horror. In Paris, he drifted between cheap hotels, sometimes with strangers he'd picked up, sometimes alone. Witnesses later remembered him looking jittery, out of place. He was desperate enough to hide among petty criminals, and, allegedly, even neo-Nazi groups offering him temporary shelter. For someone who wanted to be adored, he was now clinging to the shadows with people who couldn't care less about him. But here's the twisted irony. While he was hiding, he was also watching. Every news broadcast, every headline, every online post, he consumed it all. Luca was obsessed with his own myth. He fled because he didn't want to be caught, but he couldn't resist basking in the attention his crime had generated. He was like a moth trying to hide from the flame while circling it anyway. From Paris, he moved on to Berlin. June 2012, Neukölln district. Gritty, busy, full of cheap apartments and internet cafes. The perfect place to vanish, if you know how to disappear. But Luca didn't, because disappearing meant giving up the one thing he craved. Recognition. Interpol, Canadian authorities, French and German police, everyone was looking for him. Tips flooded in. The internet sleuths who had chased him for years now had the entire world echoing their warnings. He's dangerous. He's escalating. He won't stop. And yet, Luca believed he could still play both roles, the phantom and the star. He shaved his head, changed outfits, drifted from hostel to hostel. But he never abandoned the one habit that doomed him: searching for himself online. Think about that. He's one of the most wanted men on the planet. His victim's family is grieving. Police forces on multiple continents are working overtime. And Luca? Luca is ducking into internet cafes to type his own name into Google, refreshing news pages about himself like a man checking his horoscope. The manhunt was a global thriller now. Interpol alerts, border checks, frantic headlines. But the truth is, Luca wasn't caught by elite tactical units or high-tech spy gear. He was caught because his ego was too heavy to carry quietly. And in Berlin, in one of those internet cafes, the walls of his fantasy world finally collapsed. Berlin, June 4th, 2012. The city was buzzing the way Berlin always does. Cafes spilling onto sidewalks, students rushing with backpacks, the smell of doner kebabs drifting through Neukölln's busy streets. It's a place where you can vanish easily. Too many faces, too much noise. The perfect city for a fugitive who doesn't want to be found. But Luca Magnotta didn't really want to vanish. He wanted to be chased. He wanted to be seen. And that, in the end, was his undoing. For days, he'd been moving like a shadow through Berlin. Cheap hostels, grimy rooms, fleeting connections. Witnesses later recalled a strange, pale man keeping to himself, chain-smoking, jittery. He wasn't blending in as much as fading, a ghost with a suitcase, living off paranoia and adrenaline. But paranoia doesn't erase ego. And Luca's ego was starving. That's why he ended up in that internet cafe on Karl Marx Strasse. Think about it. Here's a man hunted by Interpol, splashed across global headlines, accused of one of the most grotesque murders in recent memory. He could have used that cafe for anything, sending emails under fake names, planning his next move, reaching out for help. Instead, Luca typed his own name into Google. over and over. That's the thing about narcissists. They can't resist the mirror. No matter how dangerous it is, they'll stare at their reflection until it consumes them. The cafe clerk noticed him. A man named Kadir and Laisli. To him, Luca didn't look like just another scruffy traveller. He looked off, gaunt, twitchy, and, most tellingly, exactly like the face plastered on the wanted notices. Because those posters weren't just in Canada anymore. Interpol had made sure Luca's cheekbones were recognizable from Toronto to Tokyo, and Kadir had seen them. Imagine the tension in that moment. Kadir looks up from his counter, glances at Luca, glances at the screen, sees Luca Magnotta, literally Googling Luca Magnotta. The arrogance, the stupidity, the surreal comedy of it all. A killer, captured not by some high-tech sting operation, but by his own compulsive need to read about himself. Kadir didn't hesitate. He picked up the phone and called the police, and this time, unlike with the kitten videos, the authorities moved fast. German officers stormed the cafe, weapons drawn, patrons scrambling. Luca barely reacted. No grand chase, no cinematic standoff. Just a pale, thin man dragged from his swivel chair, finally stripped of the one thing he clung to: control. When the officers cuffed him, he reportedly asked for something ridiculous: political asylum, as if murdering and dismembering an innocent man was some kind of revolutionary act, as if Germany would shield him from the consequences of his own staged horror show. Delusion stacked upon delusion. And so it ended not with a bang, not with some glamorous villain exit, but with a pathetic little scene in a Berlin internet cafe. Or Luca Magnotta, the man who styled himself like a movie star, brought down by the glow of a computer screen and the sharp eye of a cafe worker who refused to ignore his gut. News spread instantly. Canada exhaled. The online sleuths who had hunted him for years shouted into their keyboards. Finally. They had been right all along. He was dangerous. He was escalating. And without their relentless obsession, he might never have been caught before killing again. Berlin police paraded him in front of cameras, Interpol confirmed the arrest, and Luca's smirk. Because, yes, he still managed one, flashed across the world. He thought he was still in control, that this was just another scene in his movie. But no amount of smirking could disguise the truth. The star of his own nightmare had finally lost the script. And next came the extradition. The trial. The slow dismantling of the myth Luca Magnotta had spent years building. After his capture in Berlin, Luca Magnotta's story shifted from gruesome spectacle to courtroom drama. No more shadows, no more masks, no more online personas. Just a man in cuffs, shackled by the weight of his crimes, dragged back to the very city where he thought he had staged his perfect performance. The extradition was almost cinematic in itself. On June 18th, 2012, German authorities handed him over to a Canadian convoy. They didn't take chances. This wasn't a simple flight back home. It was a high-security operation, complete with a Royal Canadian Air Force jet. That's right. Luca got the kind of escort usually reserved for terrorists or high-level political criminals. The Canadian government wanted to make absolutely sure this man never slipped through their fingers again. When the plane touched down in Montreal, the crowd was waiting. Reporters swarmed, cameras clicked, and Luca, ever the narcissist, smirked behind his cuffs, still clinging to the fantasy that he was a misunderstood star. The reality, he was just another defendant about to face the full machinery of justice. The trial itself didn't begin until late 2014. 2 years of psychiatric evaluations, hearings, and endless speculation about Luca's state of mind. Because that was his defense, not criminally responsible due to mental illness. His lawyers painted him as a man trapped in psychosis, detached from reality, incapable of understanding right from wrong. They leaned on a diagnosis of schizophrenia, a convenient explanation for his descent into violence. But the prosecution had a different story, one of planning, calculation, and manipulation. They laid out the timeline, showing how Luca had teased his crimes online, choreographed his videos, even rehearsed his moves in earlier acts of cruelty. This wasn't the chaos of a psychotic break. It was the premeditated theater of a man addicted to attention. The evidence was damning. The one lunatic, one ice pick video. The mailed body parts. The blood-soaked apartment. Digital footprints tying him to online accounts where he had practically announced what was coming. Witness testimony tracing his movements from Montreal to Paris to Berlin. Piece by piece, the illusion of insanity crumbled, revealing cold design underneath. The trial lasted 12 weeks. Jurors listened to psychiatrists argue, to friends and family testify, to evidence that turned stomachs. They were asked to balance sympathy for mental illness against the horror of deliberate cruelty. And in December 2014, the verdict came. Guilty on all counts. First-degree murder of Junlin. Committing indignities to a body. Publishing obscene material. Mailing obscene and indecent matter. Criminal harassment of Prime Minister Stephen Harper and others. It was a laundry list of charges that read like a grotesque resume. The sentence? Life in prison with no possibility of parole for 25 years. Luca sat in court, pale as ever, eyes darting, expression unreadable. The performance was over. There would be no sequel. No glamorous interviews, no red carpet, just a concrete cell and the echoes of his crimes. And yet, even in defeat, Luca couldn't let go of the myth. After his conviction, he gave interviews from prison, wrote blog posts, even attempted to craft a new identity behind bars. He claimed he was being mistreated, that he was misunderstood, that he was still, somehow, the victim. It was the same tired script, played on repeat for an audience that had long since stopped applauding. But for once, Luca Magnotta wasn't in control of the narrative. The sleuths who had hunted him, the journalists who had exposed him, the court that had condemned him, they were the storytellers now, and his story was no longer one of mystery or glamour. It was one of cruelty, capture, and consequences. Junlin's family, dignified in their grief, thanked the jury. They had lost a son, a brother, a friend. No verdict could bring him back, but at least justice had been named. Luca Magnotta would spend the prime of his life behind bars, locked away from the world he once tried to shock into remembering him. And so the stage lights dimmed. The self-proclaimed star faded into the background of prison life. But prison, as it turns out, didn't stop Luca from trying to reinvent himself again. You'd think the story ends here. Luca Magnotta, sentenced to life in prison, locked away where he can't hurt anyone else, curtain down, monster caged. But of course, Luca being Luca, couldn't just vanish quietly into the concrete walls of a penitentiary. Even in prison, he found ways to make headlines. Pathetic, absurd, and bizarre headlines, but headlines nonetheless. After his conviction in 2014, he was sent to Port-Cartier Institution, a maximum security prison in Quebec. Cold, isolated, unforgiving. Exactly the kind of place designed to bury dangerous men in anonymity. But Luca, he immediately began doing what he always did, crafting a new persona. First came the interviews. From behind bars, he complained about conditions, about being bullied, about not getting enough attention. He even wrote letters to journalists, still trying to control the narrative, still trying to keep his name alive in the public consciousness. Then came the dating profile. Yes, you heard that right. Luca Magnotta, convicted murderer and self-styled narcissist, actually posted on a Canadian prison pen pal site. His ad read like something out of a bad romance novel. Single white male, 33, seeks single white male, 28 to 38, for a long-term committed relationship. If you think you could be my Prince Charming, send me a letter. He wanted someone loyal, preferably educated, with whom he could build a life. As if prison walls were just an inconvenient backdrop for his fairy tale. And unbelievably, someone answered. In 2015, Luca married another inmate, Anthony Jolin, in a small prison ceremony. Jolin himself wasn't exactly a saint. He was serving time for armed robbery and murder. A real love story, forged in the bleakest of settings. Luca called it his happily ever after. The Canadian press called it surreal. For cat lovers and anyone who knew Junlin's name, it was a grotesque insult. He also managed to start selling paintings from prison, trying to recast himself as an artist. Buyers, whether out of morbid curiosity or genuine perversity, paid thousands for his so-called work. Once again, Luca had found a way to exploit attention, even in captivity. And then there were the complaints. Luca wrote long, self-pitying letters about his suffering behind bars. He claimed he was being treated unfairly, denied basic comforts, tormented by guards and inmates alike. He painted himself as a victim of the system, conveniently forgetting that the only reason he was there was because he butchered a young man on camera. Still, for all his whining, he did manage to secure a transfer. In 2022, reports confirmed that Luca had been moved from maximum security to a medium security prison, where conditions are softer. Less steel, more privileges, more chances to write, to socialize, to keep feeding that endless hunger for recognition. And yes, there are still whispers of women writing him love letters, of admirers treating him like some dark celebrity. The same old serial killer groupie phenomenon. Luca's myth still hooks the weak and the lonely, even though the world has long since moved on. But make no mistake, prison isn't a catwalk. Luca's power is gone. His spotlight is gone. He's no longer the star of his own horror show. He's just another inmate in beige prison scrubs, rotting in a cell while Junlin's family lives with the hole he left behind. It's almost poetic, in a twisted way. Luca Magnotta, who craved fame so desperately that he killed to get it, now exists in a place where time erases names, where your crimes don't make you special, where the audience stops watching. He's a ghost in his own story, pacing in a cage, hoping someone out there still cares enough to type his name. And maybe that's the cruelest justice of all. A man who lived for attention, condemned to be forgotten. But before we leave him behind, we have to go back to the true heroes of this case. Not Luca, not the headlines, but the people who saw those first kitten videos and refused to let them slide. Let's get one thing absolutely straight before we move on. If it weren't for a ragtag group of people on the internet who couldn't sleep after watching a kitten get stuffed into a vacuum bag, Luca Magnotta might have kept killing for years. Police, too slow. Authorities, dismissive, but ordinary people, keyboard warriors, animal lovers, people who believed no cruelty was too small to matter, they were the first line of defense. And they nailed it. It started with a Facebook group. A place where strangers bound by fury and compassion traded screenshots, dissected Luca's videos frame by frame, and refused to look away. They weren't trained detectives. They were office workers, tech nerds, students, people with day jobs, bills, and cats of their own purring next to them while they stared into the abyss of Luca's cruelty. At the heart of it all were two names now etched into true crime history: Deanna Thompson and John Green. Deanna, better known online as Bowdy Movin', was the sharp-eyed casino data analyst from Las Vegas. She wasn't a cop, but she had a skill set built for digital trails. She noticed the tiniest details in Luca's videos. A vacuum brand, a poster on the wall, the shadows of light seeping through curtains. The kind of micro clues most of us wouldn't register. To her, they were breadcrumbs. And then there was John Green, a lawyer from Los Angeles with a steel trap of a mind and the patience of a saint. He traced Luca's movements across forums, flagged his sock puppet accounts, followed the endless trail of narcissistic breadcrumbs Luca left online. Together, they became an unlikely duo, an investigative dream team powered not by badges, but by sheer will. Let's not sugarcoat it. They paid a price. The endless hours combing through those videos left scars. This wasn't binge-watching Netflix. This was staring into the eyes of a man who got off on killing. They carried that trauma so we didn't have to. They stared into the abyss, and the abyss stared back. But they didn't blink. And Luca? Oh, he knew they were there. He taunted them, toyed with them, dropped clues just to prove he was smarter, better, untouchable. He wanted them to chase him. But he underestimated one crucial thing. People who truly deeply love animals are relentless. They will burn down their free time, their sleep, their sanity to stop a monster. And these people, Deanna, John, the whole online community, didn't just chase. They cornered him. They built dossiers more thorough than the cops. They tracked his movements across continents. They screamed loud enough for the world to finally listen. So yes, let's hand out medals here. Not to the detectives who swooped in once Luca had escalated beyond cats. Not to the politicians who shrugged when body parts landed in the mail. But to the nameless many who sat at their laptops and refused to let a monster walk free. They are the unsung heroes of the story. The kind who prove that compassion and persistence are stronger than cruelty and ego. They turned outrage into action. And in doing so, they saved lives. When history remembers Luca Magnotta, it will remember a pathetic narcissist who killed to be noticed. But when we tell this story, we remember the others. The real heroes. The people who said, "Don't fuck with cats." And from there, we step into the final chapters. What this case revealed about the internet, about how digital sleuthing can outpace law enforcement, and about how one community's obsession changed the way we view online justice forever. This is where the story gets uncomfortable. Because as much as we all want to believe in police dramas, where detectives crack cases with grit and brilliance, the reality of Luca Magnotta's manhunt exposed something else entirely. Ordinary citizens, glued to laptops and chat threads, were light years ahead of the actual authorities. From the very first kitten video, the sleuths were screaming, "This man is escalating. If you don't stop him now, he will kill a human." They weren't guessing. They weren't being dramatic. They saw it in his methods, his need to taunt, the way he staged cruelty like performance art. And they were right. The police, though? Not so fast. When the Facebook group tried reporting Luca's early crimes, they hit a wall of bureaucracy. Jurisdiction issues, lack of evidence. The fact that Luca's cruelty was just against animals, something law enforcement far too often sidelines. Local police would say it was another department's problem. Animal welfare groups didn't have the tools or manpower to chase a ghost across borders. Even when some of Luca's fake profiles and posts were flagged, authorities didn't connect the dots. Meanwhile, Deanna, John, and the rest of the online detectives were doing full-scale forensic work. They weren't just watching the videos. They were pulling metadata, analyzing still frames, zooming into blurry images of vacuum cleaners and power outlets, checking time zones by the shadows in a goddamn curtain. That's CSI-level detail work, except without the paycheck or the badge. And here's the kicker. When Luca finally did escalate, when Junlin was murdered, when body parts showed up in the post, the internet sleuths already had a profile on him. They had threads mapping his aliases, timelines of his moves, even theories about his obsession with movies like Basic Instinct and Catch Me If You Can. They knew his narcissism wasn't random. It was a script he was desperate to follow. But by then, it was too late. Junlin was dead. The system had waited for a body before they acted. It's not that law enforcement didn't care. Once the murder happened, the machine roared to life. Interpol notices, media pressure, resources pouring in. But what this case proved, loudly and brutally, is that the internet, for all its chaos, is sometimes faster at identifying danger than official channels. Crowdsourced justice saw Luca clearly years before the system did. That's the double-edged sword, though, isn't it? Online sleuthing can solve cases. It can outpace police, but it can also spiral into obsession, paranoia, and witch hunts. In Luca's case, the sleuths were right. In other cases, innocent people have been falsely accused, their lives wrecked by Reddit mobs convinced they've cracked the code. The internet is powerful, but it's messy. Still, let's give credit where it's due. Without the Facebook group, without Deanna and John, Luca might have slipped further into the shadows, maybe escalated into multiple murders before anyone caught him. They were mocked at first, dismissed as cranks with too much time on their hands, but in the end, they were the ones screaming the truth into the void, and the void finally answered. Tragically, too late for Junlin. Which brings us to the final question this story forces us to ask. What did Luca Magnotta really want? And what does it say about us that, in some twisted way, he got it? Here's the sick punchline. Luca Magnotta got exactly what he wanted. He wanted attention. He wanted to be remembered. He wanted his name burned into the internet forever. And he got it. But not the way he dreamed. He imagined himself as a glamorous anti-hero. The kind of criminal whose crimes are whispered about like legends. He wanted the same aura as the villains in his favourite movies. Hannibal Lecter, Patrick Bateman, Sharon Stone's Catherine Tremell in Basic Instinct. He wanted to be cool, ironic, iconic. Instead, he became infamous, a meme of evil, a case study in narcissism. His name is permanently glued to phrases like cat killer and Canadian psycho. When people remember him, it's not with fascination, it's with disgust. He's not Hannibal Lecter. He's not a dark genius. He's the lonely, pathetic creep who thought killing kittens on camera would make him famous, and then escalated into real murder when that wasn't enough. But infamy works in strange ways on the internet. Luca's story is now permanently etched into digital culture, not because of who he was, but because of what his case revealed. Netflix made him the subject of a globally streamed documentary. His name trends every time people discuss the ethics of true crime. Even TikTok has spawned micro-communities dissecting his videos and trial footage, kids born years after the crime still horrified by his audacity. And then there's the darker side, the groupies. Yes, he has them. Every notorious criminal does. Somewhere in some corner of the web, lonely women and morbid obsessives write him letters, defend him, fetishize him. Luca thrives on that trickle of attention like a plant starved of sunlight. Even in prison, he's still chasing clicks. But what makes his legacy really disturbing is this. Luca Magnotta wasn't unique. He wasn't even smart. He was a blueprint for something we're seeing more of. People willing to cross moral lines for internet fame. Today, it's TikTok stunts, YouTubers staging crimes, influencers faking their deaths. Luca was just an early extreme version of that same hunger. A warning of what happens when attention becomes more important than humanity. And yet, here's where we flip the script. Luca may have wanted to be remembered, but what actually endures are the people who stopped him. Deanna, John, the Facebook group, the activists who made sure the phrase "don't fuck with cats" became a rallying cry, a line in the sand. His legacy is their victory. His story doesn't belong to him. It belongs to the ones who refuse to let cruelty slide. That's the paradox Luca can't escape. Yes, his name lives on, but it lives on as a cautionary tale, as a punchline, as the eternal reminder that the internet doesn't forgive cruelty to the innocent. And most importantly, Jun Lin's name lives too. In vigils, in memorials, in the memories of his friends and family. Jun Lin was a real person with a real life, dreams and laughter that were stolen. He deserved better, and remembering him, not the man who killed him, is the only way to close this story with dignity. Because at the end of the day, Luca Magnotta didn't get what he wanted. He got what he deserved. A lifetime in a cell, remembered not as a dark celebrity, but as a coward who picked on the most vulnerable beings and called it greatness. And we remember the cats. We remember Jun Lin. We remember the heroes. And we repeat the one line that echoes louder than Luca's ego ever could. Don't fuck with cats. And that's it. Sleepless Rabble. The twisted rise and fall of Luca Magnotta. From kittens to murder to the biggest internet manhunt the world has ever seen. It's a story that proves one thing. You never, ever mess with people who worship cats. The Netflix documentary gave us the framework, but you've now heard the details they left out. The obsessive clue hunting, the sleepless heroes, the warnings ignored. And of course, the part nobody tells you, what this monster is doing today. Locked away in a Canadian prison, still trying to pull strings, still writing letters, still craving the spotlight. He wanted fame, and he got it, but not the kind he dreamed of. So now it's your turn. Smash that like button if you stand with the cat army. Drop a comment and tell us, what punishment do you think he really deserved? And hit subscribe, because this channel is young, hungry, and we need you if we're going to keep unmasking the monsters. This is NatMax True Crime. Thanks for staying with us through the darkness. Sleep tight, and remember, don't fuck with cats. Hey there, sleepless rabble. If you've been searching for a calm, true crime story to drift off to, you've come to the right place. Tonight, we're stepping into the quiet, unsettling world of Jeffrey Dahmer. The man who seemed ordinary, but hid something the world would never forget. No gore, no shock, just a slow, hypnotic retelling of how an awkward boy from Ohio became the name whispered in every true crime conversation. Before we dive in, do me a small favor. Hit like, tap subscribe, and if you want to support what I do, you can at kofi.com/NAPMAX. It keeps the stories coming. And here's my question for you tonight. What unsettles you more? How long Jeffrey Dahmer went unnoticed? Or how normal he seemed on the surface? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because I read them all. Now, settle in. Let me take over for a while. This is NapMax Sleep Stories, and you're listening to Jeffrey Dahmer, the quiet boy who became a monster. Chapter 1. The Boy in the Backyard. Bath, Ohio. A postcard town if there ever was one. Tree-lined streets, kids pedaling bikes until the streetlights blinked on. The kind of place where a summer breeze carried the smell of fresh-cut grass and charcoal grills. And somewhere among the baseball games and lemonade stands was Jeff, a quiet boy with sandy blonde hair and a gaze that never seemed to settle on the world around him. He wasn't loud. He wasn't trouble. If anything, he was the kid you forgot was in your class until roll call. His parents, Lionel and Joyce, fit the suburban script at first glance. Father, a chemist. Mother, a homemaker. Respectable, educated. The American dream, neatly packaged. But step inside that house, and the picture cracked. Arguments that escalated into shouting matches. Joyce battling her own demons. Anxiety, pills, endless complaints of illness. Lionel, buried in work, doing what men of that era did best, avoiding the emotional storm. Jeff was caught in the middle, too young to stop it, too old to ignore it. So he retreated into a world of his own making. While other kids ran screaming through sprinklers, Jeff wandered the woods behind his house, alone, looking for things that didn't run away. It started small. Bones. Tiny, harmless bones. The kind a curious kid might find and toss aside. Except Jeff didn't toss them aside. He collected them. Studied their shapes. Their clean geometry. There was something calming about the order of it. In a house full of chaos, these bones didn't argue. They didn't yell. They just existed. Soon, his fascination grew. Roadkill. Dead squirrels. A raccoon struck by a car. Things no one else would look at twice. Jeff dragged them home like trophies. Not for cruelty, at least not yet, but for control. To take apart, piece by piece, and understand what made them what they were. Neighbors never noticed. Teachers chalked his quietness up to shyness. Even his parents missed the signs, too busy fighting their own battles to see the storm gathering in their son. And so, Jeff kept collecting, kept dissecting, filling jars with remnants of things that once lived. In the backyard, behind that neat little house, a new world was taking shape. A world where Jeff wasn't powerless, where nothing left him, not even in death. But darkness doesn't appear overnight. It seeps in, slow and silent, until it feels normal. And for Jeff, this was just the beginning. Next, we'll step into his teenage years. The drinking, the fantasies, and the moment those quiet shadows inside him start demanding more. Chapter 2. Teenage Shadows. High school. For most kids, it's the age of first crushes, awkward school dances, and pretending you actually care about algebra. For Jeff, it was different. He was there, of course, sitting in those fluorescent lit classrooms. But it was like the world was on the other side of a glass wall. He could see it, hear it, but he wasn't really in it. Jeff wasn't the kid you bullied exactly. He wasn't loud enough for that. He was the kid you overlooked. The quiet one in the back row, staring out the window, while the teacher explained quadratic equations like they were the secret to eternal life. If anyone noticed him, it was probably because of the drinking. Not at first, but soon it became his thing. Where some kids carried Walkmans in their backpacks, Jeff carried rum, vodka, whatever he could get his hands on. By 16, he was sneaking sips between classes, numbing that endless hum of emptiness that followed him everywhere. Why drink? Maybe because it silenced the noise, the constant fights at home, the ache of never fitting in, or maybe because it made everything feel less real. The problem is, once you start escaping reality, reality finds new ways to get your attention. And then there were the fantasies. They started small, like flickers at the edge of his mind. A thought here, an image there. At first, they were just ideas. Controlling someone, making sure they never left. Because everyone left Jeff, didn't they? His parents couldn't even keep a marriage together. Friends? He didn't really have those. Alcohol stayed. Alcohol never walked away. So, maybe people could be like that too, if you just made them stay. This wasn't something Jeff talked about. He didn't have a diary filled with confessions or a best friend to whisper secrets to in a dimly lit basement. These thoughts lived in silence, buried under layers of awkward smiles and drunken jokes in the school hallway. On the outside, Jeff was still forgettable. He'd show up to class half drunk, laugh too loud at things that weren't funny, and fade into the background. Teachers assumed he was just another lost teenager. They weren't wrong, just not in the way they thought. By now, the collection of bones and dead things had slowed down. Not because the fascination was gone, but because it wasn't enough anymore. Jeff didn't want to just take things apart. He wanted something different. Something alive, maybe. Something that could look at him and never leave. But for now, those ideas stayed locked in his head, hidden behind a fog of cheap liquor and quiet resentment. No one knew what was brewing inside that pale-haired boy in Bath, Ohio. Not yet. And as Jeff walked across the stage at graduation, wearing the same awkward smile as every other kid, no one clapped any louder or softer for him. Because why would they? He was just another face in the crowd. Another name on a diploma. Except, he wasn't. Next, we moved to the summer after graduation. The night that turned a fantasy into a reality, and a quiet boy into something else entirely. Chapter 3, Graduation Night. Summer nights in Ohio have a certain stillness to them. Crickets humming, the smell of fresh cut grass hanging in the warm air. For most kids, graduation night is a blur of laughter and cheap beer in someone's backyard. For Jeff, it was quieter, lonelier. The diploma didn't feel like an achievement. School was over, and with it, the last thin thread of structure in his life. No more teachers, no more bell schedules, just emptiness stretching out in front of him like an endless highway. His parents were done too. Lionel and Joyce had finally called it quits. The marriage that had been crumbling for years was now officially rubble. Lionel moved out. Joyce drifted somewhere else. And Jeff? He was left in a house that felt like a hollow shell. The walls didn't echo with arguments anymore. They just echoed. So, Jeff did what Jeff always did when reality got too heavy. He drank. A bottle, then another. Anything to blur the edges of that endless, yawning void inside him. But alcohol only dulls the pain. It doesn't erase it. And when the buzz faded, the thoughts were still there. The same dark fantasies that had been creeping closer for years. That night, something shifted. Maybe it was the silence, maybe it was the liquor. Or maybe it was the realization that nothing in his life was going to change unless he made it change. And that idea, the idea of control, sparked like a match in the dark. He got in his car. The night air was heavy, thick with humidity. The road stretched ahead, empty except for the occasional glow of headlights in the distance. Jeff drove aimlessly, music playing low, his mind spinning faster than the tires. And then, like something out of a dream, there was a figure on the side of the road. A hitchhiker. Young. Alone. Thumb out. Hoping for a ride. What happened next? Well, that's the point where the story bends. The part where the quiet kid who spent his childhood collecting bones takes his first irreversible step towards something far darker. But we're not going there yet. Not in detail. Because this isn't about the shock. It's about the why. The slow burn of obsession turning into action. When the sun rose the next morning, nothing in Bath, Ohio looked different. The streets were still lined with trees, neighbors still waved as they watered their lawns. But for Jeff, the world had changed forever. And once you cross a line like that, you never go back. Next, we follow Jeff into the drift, the failed attempts at college, the army years, and the slow realization that no matter where he goes, he can't outrun himself. Chapter 4. The Drift. The summer after graduation should feel like freedom. No more teachers, no more hall passes, just an open road and a future waiting with arms wide open. For Jeff, that road was empty and it stretched on forever. No plans, no real ambitions, just a nagging hum in his chest that wouldn't go away. So he drifted. First, college. Because that's what you do, right? You pick a major, move into a dorm, and suddenly you're a whole new person. Except Jeff wasn't. He signed up for classes at Ohio State, walked those crowded hallways, and felt nothing. The same silence, the same isolation, just in a bigger building. And college had rules, deadlines, exams, social games he didn't understand. So he did what he always did when life felt too sharp around the edges. He drank. Hard. By the end of his first quarter, he'd flunked out. Just like that, college wasn't an escape. It was another failure. His father tried to help, tried to map out some kind of future for his son. And when plans A through Z fell apart, Lionel suggested something drastic. The army. Discipline. Structure. A place where Jeff could reinvent himself. And Jeff agreed, because why not? What else was there? Basic training wasn't bad. Jeff liked the order of it, the way everything had its place. March here. Eat now. Sleep when they tell you. For a while, he fit. Maybe even believed this could work, but addiction doesn't care about structure, and neither do dark thoughts. The drinking followed him, and with it the same quiet detachment that had shadowed him since high school. The army gave him a skill, though. Medical training. He learned about anatomy, about life, and how fragile it really is. Most people take that knowledge and use it to save lives. Jeff filed it away. Another tool. Another piece of the puzzle forming in his mind. 2 years in, it all fell apart. Disciplinary issues, alcohol again, they discharged him. Honorably, because that's easier on the paperwork. But the truth was, Jeff didn't belong there either. So he went back to the only place that would take him. Home. Or what was left of it. A fractured family. Empty rooms. And Jeff, spinning in a world that kept offering exits he couldn't take. He tried odd jobs, tried to be normal, but that hum in his chest, louder than ever now. And every time he thought about silencing it, the same thought returned. That night, that first step he took on a lonely road in Bath, Ohio, the line he crossed and couldn't uncross. Once you've broken that barrier, the next time feels easier, almost inevitable. And so Jeff settled into a quiet routine, drinking, drifting, fantasizing, always fantasizing. Because the thing about darkness is, it doesn't just live in your head. Sooner or later, it demands space in the real world. Next, we'll follow him into the strangest chapter yet, living with his grandmother, trying to wear the mask of normal life, while inside, the shadows grew restless. Chapter 5. Grandma's House. If you were writing a script about a serial killer in the making, you probably wouldn't add this part. It doesn't fit the trope. No dark basement filled with flickering lights, no blood-red wallpaper, just a sweet old grandmother in a quiet Wisconsin neighborhood, opening her door to her troubled grandson because she believes in second chances. That was Catherine Dahmer. Church-going, warm-hearted. The kind of woman who baked cookies for the neighbors and prayed for everyone, even those who didn't deserve it. When Jeff came back from the army, aimless and unmoored, she did what grandmothers do. She gave him a place to land, her house, her rules, her hope that a little love and structure could pull him back from whatever shadows he was walking toward. And for a while, it almost looked like it worked. Jeff went to church with her, helped around the house, shared quiet meals at a floral print table under the soft hum of a ceiling fan. If you drove past that house in West Dallas, you'd see a picture of Midwestern normalcy. A grandma and her grandson living a simple life. But inside Jeff's mind, nothing had changed. If anything, the quiet made it worse, because silence gives thoughts room to grow. And Jeff's thoughts? They weren't about church hymns or apple pie. They were about control. About keeping something, or someone, so close they could never leave. The fantasies that had been whispers in high school were now speaking louder, demanding attention. He tried to fight it in his own way. Got a job at a chocolate factory, showed up for Sunday service, even smiled when the neighbors waved. On the surface, he was doing everything right, but it was just that, a surface. Underneath, the cracks were widening. His grandmother noticed little things. The drinking, for one. The late nights. The odd smell that clung to him sometimes. She scolded him gently, like a grandmother does. Told him to straighten up, to pray harder, to keep the Lord close. Jeff nodded. Promised to do better. But faith wasn't going to save him. Nothing was. And then came the moments when he slipped. Little acts that hinted at the hunger growing inside. We won't get into details, not yet. But trust me when I say, those shadows didn't stay in his head for long. They found a way out. Quietly. Carefully. Like testing the water before diving in. Neighbors still saw him as polite, if a little odd. The quiet young man who helped his grandma with groceries and mowed her lawn. No one suspected that behind those pale eyes was a storm gathering strength, waiting for the next strike. And it was coming, because Jeff was tired of fantasizing, tired of pretending. The mask was starting to crack. Next, we step into the chapter where that mask slips completely, and the man the world would come to fear begins to take shape. Chapter 6. The Mask Cracks. On paper, Jeff's life looks stable now. A roof over his head, thanks to Grandma. A steady paycheck from the chocolate factory, sweet irony there. Church on Sundays, polite nods to neighbors, mowing the lawn in the summer sun. It was almost wholesome. Almost. But inside, he was unraveling. Slowly, methodically. Like a thread pulled from the edge of a sweater. until nothing is left but a heap of knots. The problem with pretending to be normal is that it takes effort, and effort runs out. For Jeff, every day was a performance. Smiling when spoken to, clocking in at work, nodding through small talk that felt like white noise. And after the act came the collapse. The drinking got worse. Bottles hidden in closets, nights that ended in blackout fogs, punctuated by fantasies that no amount of liquor could drown. These weren't idle daydreams anymore. They had shape, colour, details. They weren't whispers. They were marching orders. And Jeff, who had always been so quiet, so controlled, started listening. It began with slips, little moments where the mask cracked, like the time a co-worker noticed his bloodshot eyes and slurred voice during a shift, or the night his grandmother woke to strange sounds from the basement and the smell of chemicals that didn't belong in any cleaning routine. She asked questions. Jeff gave soft answers. Nothing for her to cling to, but enough for unease to settle in her bones. And then came the compulsion. The need for control so absolute it didn't matter what it cost. Jeff didn't want company in the way most people do. He didn't crave conversation or laughter. What he wanted was permanence. A presence that couldn't walk away, couldn't reject him, couldn't vanish like his parents' marriage or the friends he never had. That idea took root. And once it did, everything else faded. Church, work, promises. They were just set pieces in a life that was no longer about survival. It was about desire, dark, twisted desire, wrapped in the thin disguise of normality. Soon, Jeff's nights stretched longer. He prowled bars, not for beer, but for someone to fill that void. And when someone said yes to a drink, a glance, a smile, Jeff felt a rush that no amount of alcohol could match. Because this wasn't just fantasy anymore. This was real. Flesh and blood, real. And here's the chilling part. It didn't happen in an instant. There was no single breaking point, no lightning strike. It was a slow slide. One step, then another. Each one easier than the last. Until one night, Jeff crossed the line again, quietly, deliberately, with a calm that should terrify you more than any scream. What happened next would lay the foundation for everything that followed. The apartment, the headlines, the horror that would make his name echo through history. But we're not there yet. Because before the world saw the monster, Jeff perfected the mask one last time. Next, we follow him as he leaves Grandma's house for good, and builds the stage for his darkest acts in a small Milwaukee apartment. Chapter 7. Welcome to Milwaukee. Milwaukee, 1990. A city like any other, busy by day, humming quietly at night. Neon lights buzz over corner bars. Trains rattle past aging apartment blocks. To most people, it's just life in the Midwest. Unremarkable, ordinary. But for Jeff, this city was an opportunity, a fresh start. After years of drifting, from college to the army to Grandma's house, Jeff wanted independence, freedom, or at least that's what he told his family. Lionel thought it was progress, his boy, finally standing on his own 2 feet. Even Grandma believed it, relieved that the strange smells and late-night noises would be someone else's problem now. Jeff moved into a small apartment on 25th Street. A 1-bedroom box with beige walls and a view of nothing in particular. It wasn't much, but for Jeff, it was perfect. Quiet. Private. A space where no one would ask questions. Where the only rules were his own. He decorated sparingly. A few thrift store chairs. A fish tank bubbling softly in the corner. A bed against the wall, made just neat enough to look normal. It looked like a bachelor's apartment. Nothing more, nothing less. That was the point. By day, Jeff still played the part. He clocked in at the chocolate factory, exchanged polite nods, laughed when he was supposed to. By night, though, the mask loosened. The bar scene in Milwaukee was lively enough. Faces in and out, names forgotten as soon as they were spoken. For Jeff, it was the perfect hunting ground. And here's what makes this chapter of the story so chilling. Nobody noticed. Not really. The neighbors heard music sometimes, maybe a drill now and then, but people mind their business in cities like this. Doors stay shut, eyes look away, and Jeff knew it, counted on it. The fantasies that had haunted him for years weren't whispers anymore. They were blueprints. He didn't just want someone to stay. He wanted control, permanence, possession. And in that little apartment with its humming fish tank and cheap curtains, Jeff had found the stage for his private play. There were close calls, of course, times when neighbors complained about the smell, times when someone almost saw behind the mask. But Jeff had an answer for everything. Bad plumbing, rotten meat, excuses delivered in a calm voice, with those pale eyes that never quite gave anything away. If you passed him on the street, you wouldn't look twice. He was quiet, polite, even charming in a shy, awkward way. And that, more than anything, is why this story still grips us. Because monsters don't always look like monsters. Sometimes, they look like the guy holding the door for you at the laundromat. Next, we move into the spiral. The point where control becomes obsession. And obsession becomes a pattern no one stops, until it's far too late. Chapter 8. The Spiral. Patterns have a way of forming quietly. One choice becomes two. Two become 10. And before you realize it, the choices are making you. For Jeff, that's how it happened. What began as a craving had become a routine. Not overnight. Slowly. Like water dripping on stone until the surface gives way. It started small, nights out at the bars, meeting strangers. At first, it was about company. Or that's what he told himself. A drink shared, a few words, maybe a smile that lasted longer than most. But Jeff wasn't looking for conversation. He never was. What he wanted was something deeper. Something no one could give freely. Control. That hunger grew louder each time. The nights stretched longer. The spaces between them shorter. What had once been fantasy became habit. And Jeff, quiet, awkward Jeff, was living a life no one suspected. On the surface, he kept up the act. He still worked at the factory, clocked his hours, cashed his paycheck. He still smiled at neighbors when they passed in the hallway, carrying groceries. If anyone asked, he was fine. Just a guy living alone in the city. No drama, no trouble. But the truth? His world had shrunk to a single point of obsession. He didn't think about the future, about careers or relationships or anything normal people worried about. His thoughts looped like a broken record. Control, permanence, possession. He wanted to hold something so completely that it couldn't ever leave him. The apartment reflected that shift. At first, it looked like any other small space, messy but ordinary. Then came the little changes. A lock added to a door. A curtain drawn and never opened. A smell that no amount of air freshener could mask. Complaints trickled in from neighbors. Something foul, they said. Something wrong. Jeff had excuses ready. Always calm. Always reasonable. The freezer broke. Bad meat. And people accepted it because why wouldn't they? He wasn't the type you'd picture when you thought of danger. That's what makes stories like this so terrifying. Danger doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes It smiles at you in the elevator and says, "Have a good night." The spiral tightened with every step. The fantasies that once lived in Jeff's head now demanded more. And each time he gave in, the line between reality and desire blurred a little further, until there was no line left, just the hunger. And so, while the world outside carried on, people laughing in bars, couples holding hands under streetlights, inside apartment 213, something unspeakable was unfolding. Quietly, methodically, like clockwork. Next, we're heading into the breaking point. The smell, the sound, the suspicion that finally grows too big to ignore. And when the door finally opens, the world will never forget what they find inside. Chapter 9. The Night They Walked Away. Milwaukee, late May 1991. A warm night, the kind where the air feels heavy and time seems to slow. At 2 in the morning, the streets were mostly empty, except for one boy. 14 years old, barefoot, dazed, barely able to stand. His name was Konorak Synthesomphone, and he was fighting for his life without even knowing it. 2 women spotted him first, Sandra Smith and Nicole Childress. They were shocked. The boy was half naked, bleeding, shaking like his body wanted to run, but couldn't. They rushed to him, asking questions, trying to make sense of the scene. He couldn't answer much. Words came out broken, soft, like whispers from another world. They called the police. When the patrol car rolled up, officers John Baltazak and Joseph Gabrish stepped out. Calm, casual, as if this was another late-night disturbance in a city used to noise. They saw the boy, small, terrified, unable to stand straight. And then they saw him, Jeffrey Dahmer, walking toward them with that same flat calm that had fooled everyone before. "It's okay," Jeff said, his voice steady, almost warm. "He's my boyfriend. He's just drunk. We had a fight." The officers looked at the women, who looked back in disbelief. "He's a kid," they said. "Look at him. He's hurt." Jeff smiled, embarrassed. "He's 19, he explained, lowering his voice as if sharing a private truth. "We live together, just a little domestic thing. You know how it is." The officers shifted uncomfortably. It was 1991, and the idea of walking into a gay couple's apartment was something they'd rather avoid. So they laughed, made a joke into their radio, reuniting the lovebirds. The women begged them not to let Jeff take him back. One even pointed out the blood. But Jeff was calm, controlled, every word measured. "He's had too much to drink," he said. "He just needs to sleep it off." And then came the moment, the one that still chills anyone who hears it. The officers walked the boy back to Jeff's apartment, past the smell that clung to the hallway, past the door that hid a nightmare. Inside, they glanced around. A tidy living room, a fish tank bubbling softly. Jeff offered them beer. They declined. They didn't see the Polaroids on the dresser. Didn't open the fridge. They believed him. And they left. Konorak Synthesomphone was dead within an hour. Later, when the truth came out, those officers would become infamous. The phone call they made as they left the building, laughing about the lovers, would play on news stations for weeks, and Milwaukee would burn with anger, because the monster wasn't hiding. He was standing right in front of them, smiling, and they walked away. The last door expanded. July 22nd, 1991. Milwaukee at night, heavy with summer heat. The street shimmered under the orange glow of streetlights, quiet except for the distant hum of traffic. Inside apartment 213, the air was heavier still. Tracy Edwards sat on a worn couch, a drink sweating in his hand. He'd come here thinking it was just another night out, one more bar, one more stranger. But now, sitting under the hum of a fish tank and the low buzz of fluorescent light, something didn't feel right. Jeff was calm, too calm. His voice soft, almost gentle, as he spoke in fragments, about movies, about keeping Tracy company, about not leaving. The words were simple, but the tone, they landed like bricks. Tracy laughed nervously, trying to play along, but his eyes kept drifting to the door. It was locked, bolted, and then came the smell. Not the faint sourness he'd noticed at first. The smell that seemed to cling to the hallway, but a stronger stench, seeping from somewhere unseen. Sweet, rancid, wrong. Tracy swallowed hard. His gut told him to run. His body stayed frozen. Jeff handed him another drink. "Relax," he murmured, his pale eyes catching the light in a way that didn't feel human anymore. Tracy noticed the photographs on the dresser. Just a corner of one, half hidden beneath a wallet. He couldn't make out what it showed, just enough to make his skin crawl. Then Jeff leaned closer, whispered something. Tracy couldn't even process the words before he saw the knife. That's when instinct took over. He shoved hard and the world blurred. The couch toppled, the glass shattered, and Tracy ran. Through the door, bolt snapping loose, into the hallway, down the stairs two at a time, bare feet slapping concrete, heart pounding like a war drum. Out into the night, into the open air, his voice cracking into a scream as he waved down a passing patrol car. Two officers, Robert Routh and Rolf Mueller, watched a man collapse against their squad car, gasping out fragments of horror. Words like knife and locked door, and he tried to, before the panic swallowed the rest. They drove back to 25th Street with Tracy in the back, still shaking, pointing a trembling hand toward the door of apartment 213. Jeff opened it calmly. No panic, no sweat. Just that same quiet smile. "This is all a misunderstanding," he said softly. He let them in, showed his ID, answered every question with measured politeness, the way he always had. The officers stepped inside. The first thing that hit them was the smell. Thick, clinging, almost alive. Their eyes swept the room. Fish tank, bed, dresser. A normal apartment almost. "Mind if we look around?" one asked. Jeff nodded, stepping aside. Then came the Polaroids. At first, just one, then a handful, then dozens. Photos so precise, so deliberate, the air in the room turned colder with each frame. Mueller froze. "These are real," he whispered to his partner, voice tight, almost breaking. The cuffs came out. Jeff didn't fight, didn't beg. Just looked at them with the same flat calm he'd worn his whole life, and said, almost tenderly, "For what I did, I should be dead." And with that, it was over. The last door had opened, and the world was about to see what had been hiding in plain sight. Chapter 11. Inside apartment 213. The smell didn't just linger, it clung. Even after Jeff was cuffed and let out, the air inside apartment 213 was thick, almost sticky, with the kind of stench that lives in your clothes long after you leave. The officers stood in the doorway for a beat too long, like their bodies knew before their minds could catch up. This was no misunderstanding. They began to search. At first glance, the room looked almost ordinary. A small couch, a fish tank bubbling gently, a few framed pictures on the wall. Beige carpet, beige curtains, nothing screamed nightmare. But then their eyes adjusted to the details that made the hairs on their necks stand up. On the dresser, Polaroids, not hidden away, stacked, layered, each one more impossible than the last. Poses too deliberate, bodies too still. For a moment, the officers thought, hoped, they were fake. Then the truth sank in like ice water. They opened a drawer, more photos, a box beneath the bed. Inside, something wrapped in plastic. The shape was unmistakable. And then came the fridge. One officer hesitated before pulling the door open, as if some small part of him believed not looking could make it untrue. But the smell told the story before the door did. He slammed it shut, his stomach flipping, his brain trying to file what his eyes had seen into a category that didn't exist. They found a barrel in the corner, industrial, blue, filled with chemicals. Gallons of acid lined up neatly beside it, labels peeling in the heat. A set of power tools resting in perfect order, like instruments laid out for a symphony no one should ever hear. As the evidence techs moved in, they worked in silence. Gloves snapping, cameras clicking, each flash illuminating something worse than the last. Polaroids, bone fragments, skulls tucked away like collectibles. And with every discovery came the weight of the numbers. 17. 17 lives erased inside these walls. Men who walked in smiling and never walked out again. Each one lured with promises of easy money or a drink after dark. Each one reduced to an object in Jeff's obsessive quest for permanence. Why? That question hung in the humid air as officers documented every square inch of that apartment. Later, Jeff would explain it in words as flat as his tone. I didn't want them to leave. That was it. 6 words that carried the gravity of hell. By the time the last piece of evidence was bagged, the story had already started to leak. Reporters gathering outside, microphones buzzing, the name Jeffrey Dahmer rolling off tongues like a curse. The quiet man at the end of the hall, the polite neighbor, the factory worker, was now something else. Something the world would never forget. And the strangest part? Apartment 213 didn't look like the lair of a monster. It looked normal, ordinary, like any other one-bedroom in Milwaukee. Maybe that's what kept everyone awake at night. The realization that evil doesn't need shadows to hide in. Sometimes it sits behind beige curtains and smiles when you say hello. Next comes the trial. The cameras, the headlines, and the man at the center of it all, sitting as calm as if none of this was real. Chapter 12. The Trial and the Myth. When Jeffrey Dahmer walked into the courtroom, the world was already watching. News vans lined the streets like soldiers. Cameras flashed from every corner, their light cutting through the dull winter grey of Milwaukee. Reporters barked questions that vanished into the cold air. Inside, the tension was a living thing. Thick, electric, humming under the sound of shuffling papers and creaking benches. And then came Jeff. No handcuffs now, by court order. Dressed in a plain shirt, glasses perched on his nose, his expression as flat as a frozen lake. He didn't scan the room, didn't flinch at the sea of faces staring back. If he felt anything at all, it didn't show. 17 counts of murder. Each charge read aloud like the toll of a distant bell. 17 lives, 17 echoes, each one heavy enough to crush the air out of the room. The families sat behind him, clutching tissues, photographs, fragments of lives that no verdict could restore. The prosecution laid it out clinically. The Polaroids, the remains, the confessions so detailed they sounded rehearsed. There was no question of what happened, only why. That was the battlefield now. The defense argued insanity. They spoke of obsessions, compulsions, a mind bent and broken beyond repair. Experts testified for hours, dissecting his brain like a puzzle that might explain the unexplainable. But the prosecution countered with something colder. Choice. They said Jeff knew right from wrong, that he planned, concealed, evaded, that he wasn't insane, just monstrous. And through it all, Jeff sat motionless. His voice, when it came, was calm, almost gentle. I didn't want them to leave, he said. And later, for what I did, I should be dead. No excuses, no theatrics, just words that hung in the air like frost. The verdict landed like a hammer. Guilty on all counts. Life imprisonment. 17 terms, stacked like bricks. As if numbers could matter in a life like his. Prison was the end of the story. Almost. Jeff spent 2 years behind bars, quiet as ever, until November 1994. A mop, a bathroom, another inmate with a steel bar, and just like that, Jeffrey Dahmer was dead. Beaten beyond recognition in a place built to contain monsters. Some called it justice, others called it irony. Jeff, for what it's worth, once said he welcomed death. Maybe he meant it, maybe not. But the story didn't die with him. It never does. Documentaries, books, podcasts, Netflix binges. The name Jeffrey Dahmer has become cultural shorthand for something we still don't understand. We say it like a ghost story, shiver at the details, and then press play for the next episode. Why? Maybe because Jeff didn't look like the monster we expect. He didn't lurk in alleys or stalk through shadows. He held doors open, cashed paychecks, shook hands. He smiled at neighbors and offered the cops a beer. And that ordinariness is the part that keeps us awake at night. Because if evil can look that normal, that human, how safe do you really feel? Jeffrey Dahmer. A name that still sends shivers down the spine, not because of monsters in the dark, but because of the quiet faces we never suspect. If you made it this far, thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this, hit like and subscribe. It helps more than you think. And if you'd like to support these stories, you can do that at ko-fi.com/napmax. I want to hear from you. Why do you think stories like this fascinate us so much? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read them all. Until next time, stay curious and stay safe. This was Napmax Sleep Stories. Sweet dreams, sleepless rabble, if you can. Hey there, sleepless rabble. You couldn't sleep, could you? Perfect. Because tonight, I've got something that will keep you awake in all the right ways. Let me take over for a while. Just relax, and drift with me into the shadows of suburban America. Tonight's story? Beneath the Floorboards, the untold horror of John Wayne Gacy. A nice little bedtime tale about a man who could throw a block party, shake hands with politicians, and still have a secret under his house that would make even Netflix flinch. We're starting where every good nightmare begins, at the end. The cops already have their shovels out. The house smells like regret. And under those wooden beams lies a truth so rotten, it changed the way America looked at clowns forever. So, like and subscribe if you're brave enough to stay till the lights go out. And tell me in the comments, what's the creepiest double life you've ever heard of? This is Napmax Sleep Stories, and you're listening to Boring True Crime for Sleep, John Wayne Gacy edition. Get comfortable. This is going to get unsettling. It was a bitter December evening in 1978. Chicago wore its usual winter mask. Steel skies, streets crusted with ice, a wind so sharp it could slice right through your coat. The kind of night where you dream of warm lights and quiet rooms. Not this night. Not for the men pulling up to 8213 West Summerdale Avenue. The house didn't look like a crime scene. It didn't even look like trouble. Blue siding, white trim, a couple of holiday decorations clinging to the porch, their tinsel stiff in the cold. The yard was neat, driveway cleared. A house like this should feel safe. It didn't. Not tonight. Inside, the air was heavy. Not foul. Not yet. Just wrong. Like a room that hasn't been aired out in months, with a faint, sour undertone you can't quite name. The officers noticed it, exchanged glances, and said nothing. Boots thudded softly across hardwood floors. The living room was tidy. Family photos, a few knickknacks on the shelves, a recliner positioned just so, like someone had left in a hurry and would be back any moment. It was the picture of normality, almost staged. Crawl space is under the hallway, one detective murmured, pulling off his gloves. His voice barely rose above a whisper, like speaking too loudly might wake the house. They'd been here before, during the first search. Looked through drawers, opened closets, checked the garage. Nothing damning. Nothing that screamed crime. Just hints. A faint smell that wouldn't leave their minds. A few items that didn't belong. And the man who lived here? He smiled too easily. Now they had a second warrant. A bigger net. And with it, permission to dig. The hatch was small. Just a square of wood in the hallway floor. A hinge rusted with age. One of the officers knelt, pried it open, and a draft of air rose up from the darkness below. Thicker, heavier. The smell hit harder this time. Not strong enough to make you gag, but sharp enough to stir something primal in your gut. A smell that whispered, "Something down here isn't right." A flashlight beam pierced the black void, carving shadows across a low crawl space lined with dirt. At first it looked ordinary. Then someone noticed the soil. It wasn't flat. It was disturbed. Uneven, like something had been buried and buried again. "Start digging," said the lead detective. His voice was tight now. The shovels went in slow at first, metal scraping against frozen earth. Thud. Pause. Another thud. The rhythm built, echoing through the house like a grim metronome. Sweat gathered under collars despite the winter cold. They didn't talk. Nobody wanted to give shape to the thought pressing at the edges of their minds. Then it happened. A sound different from dirt. A dull, solid clink. The kind of sound that says you've hit something you weren't supposed to find. The officers froze. Silence thickened, hanging in the hallway like a ghost. One man crouched, brushed the soil aside with gloved hands. The beam of his flashlight trembled slightly as he leaned closer. What emerged from the earth wasn't a rock. It wasn't wood. It was something else. Something that didn't belong under the floor of a quiet suburban home. He drew back slowly. Nobody spoke. Because whatever they had just uncovered was only the beginning. And it would turn this neat little house into the most infamous address in America. Outside, the night deepened. Patrol cars sat like silent sentries along the curb, their lights dark, engines cooling in the frost. Inside, the officers marked the spot, sealed the crawl space, and stepped back into the hallway. They didn't need to say what they were all thinking. They'd seen enough to know this wasn't going to be a routine missing person case, but really, it had never felt routine. Not since the night a boy named Robert Piest vanished without a trace. Just 15 years old. A kid who worked after school at a local pharmacy. Smart, polite, the kind of teenager every parent wishes for. On the evening of December 11th, Robert told a co-worker he had a job opportunity lined up. Good money, he said. Just needed to talk to a contractor about it. That contractor's name? John Wayne Gacy. When Robert didn't come home, his family panicked. He wasn't the type to disappear. By midnight, the police were involved. By dawn, the search was on. And soon, one name kept circling back like a stubborn echo. Gacy. He seemed like the last man anyone would suspect. A respected businessman. A guy who hosted barbecues, waved to neighbors, even dressed as a clown for charity events. He worked construction, knew half the community, the kind of man who shook hands with politicians and got his photo in the paper. But there were cracks in the picture-perfect frame. Gacy was the last person known to have spoken to Robert. He had a prior conviction, one he didn't advertise. Sexual misconduct with a teenage boy. And when detectives first knocked on his door, something felt off. He was friendly. Too friendly. Eager to help. Even offered them coffee. Told them he barely knew the kid. That the whole thing was a misunderstanding. But as they walked through his house during the first search, the officers couldn't ignore the faint smell creeping from the vents. They told themselves it was plumbing, maybe mold, maybe a dead animal. They wanted it to be that simple. The search turned up nothing concrete. A few odd items, a pair of handcuffs, some books with titles that didn't sit right, but nothing they could pin on him. So they left, and Gacy smiled as they drove away. But suspicion has a way of sinking its claws in. The detectives started digging into his past. They found the old arrest record. They spoke to people who knew him. Some called him charming, others called him unpredictable, a man with a temper simmering just below the surface. And so they watched him. Around the clock, two-man teams trailing him through Chicago's icy streets. They saw him stroll into diners, laughing with friends, handing out gifts like some suburban Santa Claus. They saw him disappear into bars and re-emerge hours later, his smile never slipping. If he knew he was being followed, and he didn't seem to care. Then came the first crack. One officer noticed Gacy disposing of something in a trash can behind a gas station. Inside the bag, magazines of a very specific kind. Combined with everything else, it was enough to escalate the case. The judge signed a second warrant. This time, they were going to tear that house apart, piece by piece. What they didn't know was that every hour they waited, every polite conversation they had with this smiling man, they were standing on top of something far darker than they could imagine. Something that wasn't hiding in shadows anymore, but right under their boots. By day, John Wayne Gacy was the picture of normalcy. Scratch that. He was better than normal. He was successful. He was charismatic. He was the guy who made things happen. If you were planning a charity event, he'd be there, sleeves rolled up, grinning for the camera. Need a contractor? Gacy could build you anything. A patio, a deck, a new driveway. No problem. People liked him. Politicians liked him even more. He joined the local Democratic Party. Even got a photo shaking hands with the First Lady once. A glossy little snapshot that hung proudly on his wall. And why wouldn't it? In the eyes of his neighbors, Gacy was a model citizen, a homeowner, a businessman, a man who volunteered at children's hospitals. And then there was Pogo. Pogo the clown. Bright red nose, oversized shoes, and a painted smile that stretched far too wide. Gacy played him at birthday parties, fundraisers, and parades. A clown was harmless, right? Everyone loves a clown. That was the whole point. As Gacy himself would later say, clowns can get away with murder. But behind that grease paint grin, the mask was cracking. People who knew him spoke about two different men. One was cheerful, generous, full of jokes. The other was something else. Moody, controlling, prone to sudden bursts of anger. Employees at his construction company whispered about his temper, his strange late-night habits. They said he liked hiring young guys, paid cash, no questions asked. And then there was the house. On the surface, it looked like a bachelor's home frozen in time. Cheap paneling, mismatched furniture, the faint smell of cigarette smoke woven into the walls. But there were odd details, little things that didn't fit. The stack of handcuffs by the bed, the rope neatly coiled in a drawer, books with titles that suggested more than a passing curiosity about control. The officers trailing him began to notice patterns. Gacy stayed busy during the day. Meetings, handshakes, political functions. But at night, he prowled the streets, picking up fast food, hanging around bus stations, cruising through neighborhoods where nobody asked too many questions. One surveillance report noted how he seemed calm. Too calm. Like a man convinced he was untouchable. And maybe he was, until that second warrant landed on the judge's desk. The piece of paper that would let the detectives peel back the walls of his carefully constructed life. They didn't know it yet, but they were about to find out that behind the smiling clown, behind the community man, behind the homeowner who waved from his driveway, lay a secret so grotesque it would stain the very ground he lived on. And all it would take was one more look under those floorboards. The snow had started to fall again by the time the detectives gathered outside the house for the second time. It drifted across the streetlights like powdered glass, settling on windshields, melting into dark puddles on the pavement. Chicago was quiet. The kind of quiet that presses on your ears and makes every creak of the world feel louder. Inside, the mood was different now. This wasn't a friendly visit anymore. No polite smiles, no casual questions over coffee. This time, they weren't leaving without answers. John Wayne Gacy greeted them at the door with that same easy grin. That grin that had charmed neighbors and politicians and cops alike. He looked almost amused, like a man watching a play in which he already knew the ending. "Come on in," he said, his voice smooth as ever. "Make yourselves at home." The officers spread out. The warrant gave them everything. Attic, garage, yard, crawl space. And so they began to peel back the layers of Gacy's life. Drawers came open. Boxes spilled their secrets. A pharmacy bag sat on a shelf with a name scrawled across it in marker. Robert Peast. The missing boy. The one who had set this entire machine in motion. It was enough to turn the temperature in the room to ice. Then came the other items. A strange assortment of things that spoke louder than any confession. Nylon rope, cut into precise lengths. Rolls of tape, chains, and books. Titles that hinted at appetites most people don't admit in daylight. They logged everything, photographed everything, each piece like a shard of glass, fitting into a picture they didn't want to see. And still, that smell lingered. Stronger now, as if the house itself was exhaling something it had kept hidden for far too long. It crept through the vents, seeped into their clothes, stuck in the back of their throats. Every detective noticed it. Nobody wanted to name it. Not yet. The hatch to the crawl space was still there, that same square of wood in the hallway. One officer crouched, pried it open again, and the smell rolled out like a living thing. Thick, heavy, carrying with it the sour memory of decay. They lowered a light this time. Its beams swung across the dirt floor, illuminating dark mounds of soil, uneven, disturbed, the kind of earth that has been touched by human hands. Dug, filled, dug again. "Start digging," the lead detective said, his voice low, brittle. The first shovelful broke the silence like a gunshot, then another, and another. The sound was steady, rhythmic, each strike carving into the earth as tension curled tighter and tighter around the room. Minutes passed. Sweat rolled down faces despite the winter air. The smell grew stronger, a clinging, rancid weight that turned stomachs and made eyes water. They dug in silence, every man praying they were wrong, even as the truth rose closer with each bite of the shovel. Then the metal edge hit something that wasn't dirt. A sound that froze every muscle in the room. A hard, hollow clunk. The kind of sound you feel in your bones. They dropped to their knees, clawing at the soil with gloved hands, pulling it back in frantic handfuls. And there it was. Not a pipe, not a root. Something else, pale against the dark earth. Smooth, curved. A piece of a jaw. Someone swore under his breath. Another turned away. Hand clamped over his mouth. Because in that moment, the nightmare became real. All the rumors, all the suspicions, they were standing on top of something far worse than they had imagined. And as the dirt gave way to more shapes, more fragments, they realized this wasn't just one. There were others. Dozens, maybe. Layer upon layer of horror, packed into the ground like secrets no one was ever supposed to find. The house was silent, except for the sound of shovels and the ragged breathing of men who knew they had just opened the door to hell. The crawl space had turned into a tomb. The officers stood hunched in the narrow hatch, their flashlights trembling as beams of cold light swept across a scene that words could barely hold. Shapes emerging from the dirt. Pale curves. Brittle fragments. Teeth glinting faintly like broken porcelain. At first, they thought it was one. One life stolen, one secret buried. That hope died fast. With every scoop of soil, more appeared. Ribs, long bones stacked like firewood, tangled in the earth like roots. It was as if the ground itself had swallowed voices, and now it was spitting them back up. The smell was unbearable now. It clung to skin, to clothes, to the back of their throat like a living thing that wouldn't let go. One detective turned away, retching into the shadows. Another muttered something. Maybe a prayer, maybe a curse. Nobody spoke above a whisper. The house had become a cathedral of horror, and silence felt like the only appropriate hymn. By the time the first body was lifted out, every man in that room knew this wasn't an accident. This wasn't a heat-of-the-moment crime. This was something else. Something organized, calculated, planned down to the last shovelful. They stopped counting after 3, then 4, then 5. The number didn't matter anymore. What mattered was this. They were standing inside the work of a man who had turned his home into a graveyard. When they went back upstairs, John Wayne Gacy was waiting. Calm, almost amused. He sat in his favorite chair like a king on a throne, watching the dirt-streaked detectives file past him. And then, without a flicker of remorse, he spoke. "You want to know?" he said. His voice was steady, almost casual, like he was about to give directions to the nearest diner. "I'll tell you everything, but you better get me a cigarette first." They brought him one. And as the smoke curled upward in lazy spirals, Gacy began to talk. About the crawl space, about the boys, about how they ended up under his floor. 33. That was the number he gave them. 33 lives reduced to bones in the dark. And here's the thing. He didn't cry. He didn't flinch. He didn't even seem ashamed. If anything, he looked relieved. Like a man finally setting down a heavy bag he'd been carrying for too long. Outside, the snow kept falling, muffling the world in white. Inside, the detectives wrote down every word, their pens scratching like insects on paper, trying to keep up with the confession of a man who had just admitted to being one of the most prolific killers in American history. And still, somewhere in that house, under layers of dirt and silence, the dead were waiting to be named. Before the crawl space, before the clown, before the name John Wayne Gacy became a headline burned into America's nightmares, there was just a boy. A boy growing up in the flat sprawl of Illinois in the 1940s. He was the second child, the only son, in a house where warmth was rationed and affection was a foreign language. His father, an auto repairman, was the kind of man who thought tenderness was weakness. He drank hard, spoke harder, and kept his fists ready for emphasis. John learned early that love in his house came wrapped in conditions and bruises. He was small for his age, sickly. A weak heart kept him from sports, the holy grail of boyhood respect. Instead, he stayed inside, clinging to the approval of his mother and sisters, trying to dodge the backhanded comments and outright blows from the man who should have been his protector. His father called him a sissy, a mama's boy, words that cut deeper than any belt ever could. And yet, young John tried. He joined the Boy Scouts, took on odd jobs, tried to stand tall even as his shadow felt paper thin. But resentment has a way of seeping in through the cracks, drop by drop, until it pools into something darker. By his teens, he was already rehearsing the mask. The smile that could light up a room, the easy jokes, the confident handshake. People liked him. They didn't see the cracks. They didn't hear the voice in his head that sounded an awful lot like his father's, whispering that he'd never be enough. Fast forward to his 20s, he marries, has kids, tries to play house in Iowa, managing a fast food chain like the American Dream poster boy. But the dream frays quickly. His appetites don't fit inside the white picket fence. He drifts into shadows, seeking things that polite society would rather not name. By 1968, the law catches up. An assault on a teenage boy. Prison follows. Now, prison is supposed to break you down or straighten you out. But Gacy, he thrived. Became a model inmate. Cooked meals, organized events. Charmed the staff so well, they shaved years off his sentence. When the gates opened, he walked out smiling. Chicago welcomed him back like a prodigal son. He started a construction business, PDM Contractors, and built more than houses. He built a reputation. Friendly, helpful, the guy who'd show up at your door with a toolbox and a joke. A man who hosted summer barbecues, who strung Christmas lights with care. But masks are heavy things. And when you wear one too long, it starts to fuse with your skin. Gacy wore his like a second face, so well that even when people glimpsed the darkness, they doubted their own eyes. By the mid-70s, he wasn't just blending in, he was thriving. A successful businessman, active in local politics, shaking hands with mayors and smiling for cameras. He even had a little side gig. A character he called Pogo the Clown. Painted face, candy-colored suit, balloon animals for the kids. Who doesn't trust a clown? Behind the makeup, though, was a man who had learned one cruel truth. If the world calls you a monster, you may as well play the part. What no one knew, not the neighbors, not the cops, not even the men who drank with him in smoky Chicago bars, was that the mask had stopped being a disguise. It was who he was now, and everything beneath it was rotting. There's something about clowns. For some, they're joy wrapped in grease paint, a childhood memory of balloon animals and birthday cake. For others, they're nightmare fuel in Technicolor. But for John Wayne Gacy, the clown wasn't just a costume, it was a weapon. He called himself Pogo. The name alone sounds harmless, doesn't it? Like something bouncing around at a carnival, laughter trailing in its wake. And in a way, that's exactly what Pogo was meant to be. Harmless, disarming, a smiling mask to hide the teeth underneath. By the mid-70s, Pogo was everywhere in Gacy's world. Charity events, parades, visits to children's hospitals. He stitched the costume himself, a candy-striped suit, a floppy hat, and a face painted in broad, garish strokes. But here's the detail that chills even the most seasoned criminologists. His clown makeup broke the cardinal rule of clown design. Professional clowns paint rounded shapes, soft curves, friendly lines. Gacy's, sharp angles, hard points. His smile didn't curve gently, it slashed upward like a knife. Even in photographs, the eyes seem wrong. Not playful, not safe. The kind of eyes that look at you, not through you. He loved the power it gave him. As Pogo, he could cross boundaries no ordinary man could. People let their guard down around a clown. A clown can lean close, touch your shoulder, tie a balloon to your wrist, and nobody flinches. That was the beauty of it. The mask wasn't just paint. It was permission. Neighbors thought it was sweet. "Oh, John's so good with kids," they'd say, watching him waddle down the street in full costume, oversized shoes slapping the pavement. They had no idea that the man inside that suit was feeding something dark. Psychologists later called it a coping mechanism, a way to channel urges he couldn't name. But maybe it was simpler than that. Maybe Pogo was the only time Gacy felt untouchable. No shame, no fear. Just pure, unchecked control hiding behind a grin big enough to swallow the world. When they searched his house, they found the costume neatly folded in a box, makeup kits stacked like tools in a workshop. It wasn't evidence of a job. It was a manifesto in red and white, proof that the man who entertained children by day was living out his darkest fantasies by night. Years later, someone asked him why the clown. His answer? A smirk. Then the words that would burn themselves into the annals of criminal history. Clowns can get away with murder. They called them missing persons, as if the word missing could contain the truth. As if a single adjective could capture the gravity of 33 vanished lives. But in the early days, that's all they were. Posters on telephone poles, blurry photographs fading in the Chicago wind. Young men, teenagers mostly, some barely shaving, some already dreaming of the life waiting for them beyond high school. They weren't the kind of kids who made headlines. They were sons of factory workers, busboys, runaways looking for a warm bed and a break. In another world, they would have grown up, fallen in love, paid mortgages, coached Little League. In this one, they slipped through the cracks and into the orbit of a man who wore trust like a tailored suit. Gacy had a method. It started with charm, a friendly smile, a promise. Sometimes it was work, cash-in-hand jobs with his construction company, easy money, no questions asked. Other times, it was just the offer of a ride on a bitter Chicago night. The kind of kindness that doesn't set off alarm bells. Who says no to a man who seems respectable? A man who shakes hands with politicians and dresses as a clown for charity events. He knew how to talk, how to make himself sound safe. He'd mention connections, opportunities, maybe even dangle the idea of a better life. To a kid who felt invisible, that kind of attention was gold. And so they said yes, they got in his car, they followed him home, and from that moment, the world would never see them again. The tragedy isn't just in what happened to them. It's in how long it took anyone to notice. Back then, missing teenagers were often written off as runaways. "He'll turn up," the cops would say, shrugging at frantic parents. And when the boys didn't come back, the silence grew heavy. One family after another learned what it feels like to sit by the phone in the dark, praying for a ring that never comes. When the crawl space finally gave up its dead, the horror became arithmetic. Bones laid out on sterile tables, tag numbers standing in for names. 33. The papers called it the body count, but it wasn't a number. It was laughter cut short. It was birthdays that never came. It was futures folded up and buried in dirt. Some of them were identified quickly. Others took years, decades even. For some, the wait isn't over. To this day, fragments of lives still whisper from that black pit under the floorboards. Gacy never said their names when he confessed, just the number. 33. As if reducing them to digits could make them easier to carry. The detectives, hardened men who thought they'd seen it all, broke down when they read those names out loud in court. They knew what the jury knew, what the cameras knew. That evil isn't a monster lurking in the shadows. It's a man next door with a grin too wide and a handshake too firm. And when you look at the photos, those ordinary faces staring back through time, it's hard not to wonder how the world let them slip away. The trial began in February 1980. By then, John Wayne Gacy wasn't just a suspect. He was a brand, a headline, a walking horror story with a face America couldn't stop staring at. The cameras loved him. The journalists swarmed like flies on sugar. And in the middle of that human storm sat Gacy, calm as a man waiting for his morning coffee. He'd already confessed. 33. The number clung to him like a shadow. And yet, here he was, smiling, cracking jokes, leaning back in his chair like this was some kind of game show. If he was supposed to look broken, he didn't get the memo. The prosecution called it premeditated evil. They laid out the evidence in neat rows, photographs of the crawl space, diagrams of the house, bags of personal effects tagged and numbered like relics from a private hell. Witness after witness stepped up. Former employees, neighbors, families of the missing boys who now sat in the gallery with faces carved from grief. And then there was the confession. Not a sobbed admission of guilt, but a casual inventory delivered with the calm of a man reciting a shopping list. He described the crawl space like a homeowner explaining a renovation. He spoke about disposing of problems, as if those problems had never been human. The defense tried to paint him as insane, a split personality, a man so fractured he didn't know right from wrong. They brought in psychologists, spoke about childhood trauma, about head injuries, about the scars left by a brutal father. But Gacy himself wasn't buying it. "Insanity is for the weak," he told one reporter with a smirk. "I knew what I was doing." The jury didn't take long. 33 guilty verdicts, 12 death sentences. The judge's gavel felt like a coffin lid, and still Gacy smiled. "Kiss my ass," he told the courtroom as deputies led him away, a phrase that would become his final act of defiance. From that moment on, Gacy's life shrank to a concrete cell and a ticking clock. 14 years on death row, 14 years of appeals, interviews, and a bizarre second career as a painter. Yes, a painter. He turned to art behind bars, churning out garish canvases, many of them clowns, faces twisted in colour and grin. People bought them, collected them, framed them. Because nothing says conversation piece like the brushstrokes of a killer. The media kept coming too. Talk shows, tabloids, even true crime tourists writing letters like he was some dark celebrity. And Gacy fed it, every bit of it. He gave interviews dripping with arrogance, tossing out lines that made headlines for days. I'm the 34th victim. They wanted a monster, so they made one. He was wrong, of course. The monster wasn't made. He built himself, brick by brick, smile by smile, until the mask became the man. By the time the execution date was set, America had turned the page. There were new headlines, new horrors. But for the families of 33 boys, the clock was the only story left. And it was running out. May 10th, 1994. Stateville Correctional Center. The room was small, white, clinical. The kind of place designed to look sterile, like killing could somehow be clean. Outside, a crowd gathered. Some with signs demanding justice, others waving grotesque souvenirs. T-shirts with his name, badges with his face. A carnival atmosphere, as if death had become a spectator sport. Inside, John Wayne Gacy lay strapped to a gurney, leather belt cinched across his arms and chest. His face, older now, softer, worn down by 14 years of waiting, still carried that smirk. That maddening, casual grin that said, "You think you won?" Reporters scribble notes. Witnesses press their palms against glass. And Gacy, never one to miss a stage cue, gave them a line that would echo long after the poison hit his veins. "Kiss my ass." Those were his last words. No apology. No confession of the soul. Just a vulgar little bow from the man who once dressed as a clown to make children laugh, and instead turned laughter into screams the world would never hear. The drugs slid into his veins in slow succession. Sodium thiopental, pancuronium bromide, potassium chloride. A scientific cocktail with one purpose: to stop a heart that had never learned to feel. His chest rose once, twice, then stilled. Official time of death, 12:58 a.m. And that was it. A headline closed. A chapter finished. Or so it seemed. But endings are never that neat, are they? Especially when the story sprawls across 3 decades, 33 graves, and 1,000 broken lives. Because Gacy didn't just kill. He built an empire of silence in plain sight, brick by brick, smile by smile, while the world kept clapping for the show. Think about it. For years, this man lived among us. He threw block parties, he shook hands with the local politicians, he posed for photos with the First Lady, he wore a painted grin and juggled balloons for kids in hospital wards, and all the while, under his house, beneath those neat little floorboards, lay a kingdom of bones. 33. That's the official count. But numbers don't tell the story. Numbers don't tell you about the 15-year-old boy lured by a promise of a job. Or the runaway who thought he'd found a safe place for the night. Or the young man who trusted a smile that looked too honest to be dangerous. They don't tell you how he planned it. The pattern was chilling in its simplicity. Charm. An offer. A quiet drive back to Summerdale Avenue. Then the crawl space swallowed another secret. Rope. Not practice to perfection. A ritual of control dressed up as hospitality. When the officers started digging, they thought they'd find one. Maybe 2. They found an ossuary, a hidden graveyard, layered like the rings of a tree, each ring marking another life extinguished under those beams. And when they ran out of space under the house, he moved on to rivers, tossing the evidence into black water as if it could wash his sins away. And yet, when they asked him why, when the microphones crowded his face and the world leaned in for the answer, Gacy didn't give them the courtesy of guilt. He gave them sarcasm, jokes, denial sprinkled like ash. They wanted a monster, he said once, lips curling in that familiar smirk. So they made one, as if the crawl space had been dug by committee. He even called himself an artist in the end. Turned his cell into a studio, churning out paintings of clowns and skulls, landscapes dripping in irony. People bought them, framed them, hung them on walls like cursed relics, because nothing says human fascination like turning evil into art. 14 years on death row, and he never broke character, never flinched. Even as the needle slid in, even as the crowd outside counted down like it was New Year's Eve, Gacy stayed the showman, a clown to the last breath. But here's the truth. No headline captures. Monsters rarely look like monsters. They look like men who mow their lawns, wave from their driveways, smile when they pass you in the grocery store. They look safe. They sound kind. They promise you a job, a ride, a little fun. And then, when the door closes and the mask slips, the world falls away. Tonight, his house is gone. Torn down years ago, the earth bulldozed flat. But the ground remembers. It always does. And when the wind blows across that patch of Illinois dirt, it carries whispers no prayer can silence. John Wayne Gacy is dead. But the story? The story lives on. Because deep down, we all want to believe monsters live in the dark. The truth is, sometimes they live right next door. And that sleepless rabble was the story of John Wayne Gacy. A man who proved that monsters don't hide under beds. They build them. And sometimes they throw in a crawl space for good measure. If you made it this far without checking under your floorboards, congratulations. You're braver than most. If you want more stories like this, quiet, haunting, and just a little too real, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. Maybe even like the video. Because unlike Gacy, I promise I won't bury anything under your house. And tell me in the comments, do you think someone like Gacy could pull it off today in a world with cameras on every corner? Or are we still blind when we want to be? This has been NatMax Sleep Stories. And you've been listening to boring true crime for sleep. John Wayne Gacy edition. Now close your eyes and dream of better neighbors.